were never unclean anyway. They were just regarded as unclean. And it took some time until they really could see that the heathen are not unclean at all there, and in big numbers they were accepting the truth. That was, of course, amazing for the Jews who were having such a big prejudice and they had such big pride. I sometimes you meet today also some Jews. They say, "Still, we are the chosen nation, and you are really not much worth." What a pity. But I have to say, I also know very good Jews. I was mentioning my concerns, and they said, "Yes, it's really embarrassing that many in our nation are thinking this." But I was teaching my children to always give the hand, or to also non-Jews, what many Jews wouldn't do because you're unclean and so on. But there are also many Jews who are seeing things clearly, and they try to behave more in a Christian manner, I would say. So what we see that Jesus was teaching his disciples to disperse in all the world, to preach the gospel in all the world. We can read that in Matthew 28, 20, and until the end. And so that's what they did. He was teaching them also in the last 40 days in Galilee before he went to heaven, where to go and what to teach and how to start churches and all this. You can read that in the book, what's it? There are books around that teach that. Yeah, confirmation of Jesus also. It says also the previous to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, so 35 years after Jesus went to heaven, by the Roman army, at which time the apostles were dispersed. The gospel in Ethiopia, Syria, Asia Minor, in India. That was probably the places where Jesus was sending them directly. And after the Roman army conquered Jerusalem and probably the Israel also, so they had to flee. And they warned them when you see the armies putting their standards where they shouldn't. That's where then you really had to flee. And in 66 AD, the Roman army came and was making a siege around Jerusalem and were besieging them to conquer them. But I think it was only a few weeks, and then there was a big problem for the Romans somewhere near the Mediterranean Sea in Tyre, and there they had them quickly to go and help them. So the Christians who were remembering what Jesus said, if the Roman armies come and put their standards on holy ground, then you have to flee. So 90,000 Christians were leaving Jerusalem, and they went to the Jordan in a small city, Pella, and later on they founded then their headquarters in Antioch. Even in the Bible we read about in the book of Acts that they were starting to call themselves Christians in Antioch. That was from there on, I think they built their university and were really making very big efforts to spread the message to Asia and to Africa, and partially also to Europe. So that was really the goal of the Christians, to spread the news. Imagine what a difference. Before you had all kinds of strange ideas about God, and he has to be a peace, and he's a cruel God, and he's difficult, and all of a sudden you hear, the God came down, he became man, and he died for us. Imagine. You always had such different thinkings about God. They are up there and they enjoy life, and they leave us alone here. So God had always a bad reputation in the world. And then when he sent his son here to live with us, and he was beaten, and they were spitting at him, and they were mistreating him, and he always stayed nice, he always stayed friendly, he was teaching us, and he was really a wonderful example like never ever before. And in the end, he was even dying for us. That was unheard of. And many big masses of the Jews who were also spread around in Europe and Asia, and also of heathen, they were accepting this message, and they, I'm sure, I believe one of the reasons, of course, the message is wonderful that God came down and died for us. That's unheard of already this. But you must understand the difference between if you have a Christian who is really living with God, then the Spirit of God lives in him, and he's friendly and patient. And we know it from the stories of Paul. He was then cast out of the city, and they stoned him and they beat him. And he was just friendly and went away, and he didn't say anything. If you do that with somebody who is not the Spirit of God in him, what happens then? You start cursing and shouting, and now don't do that. So you see, if you observe these differences between people who are not going with God, then the Spirit of God, of course, doesn't live in them. And if the Spirit of God doesn't live in you, what happens then? There will come another spirit. And another spirit, of course, you can be educated, you can learn how to behave in some instances, but when you're really getting beaten and so, then most people, they would start defending themselves and start shouting and cursing and all that. The apostles didn't have that necessary to do because they knew we are in the hands of God, we are doing God's will, and we are fulfilling His commission. If God wants us to die here, then so be it. We will not, because of this, start cursing and shouting. But all the others, they behave completely different, and the people, they observe that. I read books about in Rome at these Caesars places where they had lots of employees, of course, these Caesars. They were also Christians, and in the end, these Caesars, they had to give up because they saw that their employees, they saw the bad behavior of the Caesars. They were very proud and arrogant, and they were killing people just because of they had fun with it, and they were bringing the Christians to the Colosseums to kill them because it was so much fun for them. Imagine that difference to a humble Christian who was praying sincerely, who was always friendly, even if he's cursed. So these differences they saw, and the Christians got more and more. And it says the blood of the martyrs was the seed for the new Christians. And so they had to invent, I think Satan had to invent another method because he saw, oh, the Christians are getting more and more. So he was having basically, we know what happened then. They were combining these heathen customs and festivals and worship days with Christianity. They put it all in a pot and it was traded well, and then came out Catholicism. So that's a mixture between Christianism and heathenism. Many things are from there. For example, in the Council of 325 in Nicaea, they were inventing celibacy. Celibacy has nothing to do with the Bible. It came from the Babylonians. They were inventing that there are three gods all of a sudden. There were no three gods before. It was the Father and the Son. In the whole Bible, you will find only the Father and the Son. But they were inventing, all these religions, they had always three gods. The Greek, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, they had always Isis, Osiris, and something else. So they always had three. So they had to think, how can we do that? So they were inventing, okay, let's say it's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. That was only coming in 325 before. That was unheard of. Maybe in Alexandria it came slightly before that, where all these abominations were bred, and they came from there. That was the case. So we see here that in the gospel went then very far. That means there was basically all the world was reached within a short time by the apostles, and there were 120 apostles, not apostles, there were 12, but there were 120 disciples who went to Galilee to be taught by Jesus and how God spread the good news. And in that way, it was spread everywhere. So we read also here, John was sent in the spirit and power of Elijah to prepare the way of Jesus. So there had to come at first somebody to prepare the way. They were already so much off from the truth, from the real religion, with their fancy new ideas, that God had at first to send somebody to prepare the way, to bring the people partially back to the original who rejected the testimony of John, they were by the teachings of Jesus. So if somebody hears the truth, and John was preaching the truth of God, and you will reject it and say, no, I mean, I don't want to change, I'm happy as I am, and that sounds very nice, but I don't need it. Then, of course, the Spirit of God draws back, and you cannot understand then anymore so well the truth of God. That's how it is. And then, when the Messiah came, many were then listening to the Messiah, and sometimes we think, how can it be? I mean, these Pharisees, they were really seeing in front of their own eyes that a man who was 4 days dead was raised. How couldn't they understand that Jesus was? When you already were engaging John the Baptist, John the prophet that was sent by God, then the Spirit of God was back, and the most clear proofs of Messiahship of God, they didn't understand. As you reject the message, it gets more and more difficult, your conscience gets more and more silent, the inner voice, you can hardly understand it anymore, and then it gets more and more difficult to understand the truth. God was sent, and when you were electing the Messiah, they also were, then when the disciples were preaching in Jerusalem, I mean, 3,000 were accepting Jesus in one day. That's very nice, but the majority didn't accept him. So we read that 90,000 Christians were fleeing out of Jerusalem, but that was 90,000 in comparison to million who stayed in Jerusalem and who were thinking, no, we're here, we have everything right. And they were then, I think 1 million was killed and 1 million was left into captivity when 70 AD, this army came back from the Romans and they destroyed 3.5 years later, after the first siege, they destroyed Jerusalem and killed 1 million of Jews. That was very, very sad. But also this even was giving a boost to Christianity because it was also foretold by Jesus that there would come an army and destroy Jerusalem. Jesus said that, and it was giving a lot of food for thought for the Jews who were dispersed in all the world. That Jesus said that, and all it happened. Wow, amazing! So it must have been really something with it. So we really have to study the scriptures again, what he said, and that was giving another boost to Christianity when it was destroyed. And you can read that from was and you see that that time we were writing a lot of things that for example, that we were 90,000 were fleeing, that was from Josephus. And so also Christianity was spreading. And so that was a big effort, impact on the Jews who did not reside in Palestine. Stunned by this event, they listened to the gospel and untold numbers turned to Christ. These did a great work in establishing the church in all parts of the world. So when these Jews saw the Trinity came true, we never thought that. We thought we are the chosen ones, and now this happened. Well, it happened only because we rejected the Messiah. So it was kind of clear. Jesus was foretelling it, then the disciples were preaching it, and then it happened. If you do something, it will happen tomorrow, and it will happen, and it will be that's always very because we cannot foresee the future in 35 years, and we like that God. But this is always true that the message is contact God. So by this, Christianity could spread very far and very wide and fast. And in that book, it's actually here, this book, you might know it. It's called Truth Triumphant, a very good book. You can download it on the internet, Truth Triumphant. It's really a must read, so good it is. Please download it and read it. And there you can also see how Christianity was spreading in Asia in a short time. In China, there are a lot of Christians. In India, in Japan, in Mongolia, and all these places, Africa, it was spreading, and also parts of Europe. Because Europe was kind of occupied by the West Rome, that was the Christianity that was developing Rome itself, which was the opposition to the Christianity that was developed in Antioch in this area. So there were the basically two theologies spreading. We can learn also from the history that there was coming up a problem. So if something goes very well for Christianity, if the word of God is spread wonderfully, then of course it makes us happy, but it doesn't make everybody happy because there's always somebody who when the message of Christ is spread well. And so what would Satan do to hinder that? I mean, there are all millions of pieces of scripture around. Imagine there's this man who's traveling to India to buy houses and when he was traveling for 2 weeks, he writes a letter to his wife home. Dear Clementina, I want to say that I really miss you, that I hope to come back soon, and God bless you. And then we will write maybe a Bible text under it, and I greet you with this text. So these fragments were found by the millions in all the world, also in my scriptures, especially in Qumran, where we will learn even more about that. And if we take these scriptures and compare them, then at that time of Lucian, that was, I think he was dying in 250 was dying. That means at this time there were already so many different scriptures, different words of scriptures around that he was concerned. So if you want to solve a message to be spread, then you have to corrupt because then you have to introduce also new scriptures which are almost the same, but they have significant differences. And then they will be all getting confused, but here it says so, and here it says 3 words, here it says 2 words. Very strange, and I don't understand it. And so it will, of course, make people very unsafe, and they think it means something is wrong. They don't know anymore what to believe. And exactly that's what happened, especially in Alexandria, in the university. There is the church fathers like Augustinus and Justin the Martyr, and there's a long number which are usually quoted originally a lot by Catholic teachers, nowadays more and more also by Protestants, unfortunately. And they were writing theologies that, I mean, some people they still like them. We don't here. We think it's all wrong what they wrote, or almost all is wrong what they wrote. And they were, of course, bringing their scriptures amongst the people. And then Lucian, he was the professor for archaeology in the University of the Christians in Antioch. He said, "No, we can't go on like this. If we have so different versions, we don't know anymore what's right and wrong." So he was preparing some scientists, and they went, as far as I read, 3 years. They went. The group went through all Europe, and they were collecting all these scriptures and manuscripts that they could find. They brought them with to Antioch, and they were putting them all next to each other and read them and wanted to find out which version is the correct one. And I think it took them over a year to get that all together. And then they were, unfortunately, they had to say, we compared them all, and what we could find out is that there are 80 main versions around, and then sub-versions. So there's so many versions. We cannot say at all which version is correct, which is of course very discouraging. When I was reading the book, I thought, well, I thought my Bible is correct, but when there are 80 versions and other versions around, then it might be not so correct. Anyway, before this, just before that, I was still quite young when I was reading that, so I had some doubts about the Bible because I knew that the Bible was put together, all these books, at the same time when the Catholics started to emerge and to be born. And that gives a little bit of doubt about all these things, which is what the Bible was not. And that way, I was having small doubts about the Bible. And then I was reading this, of course, as a book. So hard. So they were not finding anything that they could use to make a plain statement. What's the correct version? That's very discouraging. But I was reading on, and I'm very glad that I read on in the book because it's in the end it's very encouraging. I can already tell you the end from the beginning. It was like this, so he had a good idea, so he went through all Europe and he couldn't find anything that's somehow terrible and that shows which is the correct and the incorrect, because Europe is occupied by West Rome, so this is where the theology of Alexandria and also Jerusalem and Rome, these three cities together, they were developing a completely different Christianity than those from Antioch. They sent their missionaries mainly to Asia and to Africa because West Rome was occupied by Rome. So where today is Europe, that was taken care of the Romans, and so they hadn't much access there. It was difficult for them to get there because they were the enemies, basically. So what did Lucian do then? He was sending a lot of scientists to Asia and many to Africa to collect all the scriptures that were around. And they collected thousands of scriptures from Asia and 10,000 of Africa, and they brought them back to the university. And they put them all next to each other and investigated, okay, this is the same text as this is the same as this is there. And probably they had boxes where they put in the different fragments. That is the box for Luke, that's the box for Matthew, that's the box for Mark, and so on. And then they were, okay, and that we got is just the same. There is no difference in nothing. It's just there. You calculate something from the most southern tip of Africa and the most eastern tip of Asia. It's just the same. Because West Rome didn't have any access there, they were concentrating only on Europe, and the rest of the world, they, thank God, they forgot. They had no access there because the Christians were already recognizing that, and they were rejected. Their Catholic system was rejected in these areas. So Lucian was really the one whom we can thank for today. It's called Textus Receptus. That is the received text in English. That means, as far as I've read, there are lots of books around that, so you can also stop the video and read in the books if you want to. In the books it says 98.5% of all the manuscripts that are around in the world are completely equal to the Textus Receptus. And this here, for example, is a King James Version. And in the King James Version, you can read the translation of the Textus Receptus. So the New Testament in most of it is Greek, and the Old Testament is Hebrew and partially Aramaic. And that is the Textus Receptus. And then, of course, that one was spread then with a lot of the continents in Asia and in Africa. Of course, in West Rome, they had their versions. And when the Reformators came later in 1500, like Luther and Calvin and Zwingli, and also before already was John Wycliffe in England, and Hus in Prague. So there are lots of reformers. Almost all cities in my country, they have a reformer, like Zwingli in Zurich, around those two, but also in the other cities, they have reformers. And that's where the people got to read their own Bibles, and then it really got dangerous for the Catholics because the people could then read the prophecies, and at that time it was, I think they were without preconceptions reading the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation, and when you read it really without preconceptions, you will have to find out, I have a real old Bible at home. It's so thick, it's 7 pages heavy, and it's from 1850, printed in 1850, and you always have some comments below. Here also have some comments below, and when you read these comments it's a Greek Bible from England, so you can read there from, I don't even know the one who was doing these comments, but he was definitely a Protestant because it's a King James version. I compared it also to my version here, and it's just the same. So at least since 1850, I didn't find a single difference. But the comments were interesting. I went directly to the Daniel, and I saw that it's written there. And all these the fourth beast is the beast in Daniel 7 and 8. So it's Rome, and they were clearly stating that the Vatican, the popes, they were the Antichrist, and they were the beast, the Revelation. So that was still common sense at that time. Nowadays, it's getting slowly dangerous to say it. So but if we stick to what the reformer said, then we can continue to say it, because I think it's just what we can read out if we don't have any preconceptions. Okay, so what happened then? We can continue. Of course, that simple theology that we have today, where it says, okay, Jesus came to die for our sins, and that was the fulfillment of these Old Testament prophecies, where they had the feasts of Pentecost and of all these were fulfillments when Jesus came, and this system is also made by Lucian and his university, and they were spreading it all over the world in no time. Okay, so that's what we were just reading. Of course, there were people like Jerome and Erasmus later who were trying to bring in the other texts. And when the people could read their Bibles, then the Catholics had to invent something. And what did they invent? They all of a sudden they said, okay, we have in our archives here at the Vatican, we have here very interesting manuscripts, and they showed these manuscripts to the world and said, look, these manuscripts are older than yours. As we said, 98.5% of all manuscripts, they are complete according to the Textus Receptus. But they said, okay, we have only 1.5% of all the manuscripts in the world, but they are older, and that's why they are correct, and yours are at that time one. There came loads of Bibles, like in English, the New International Version, and I don't know them all because I would never read them. I would never open the Bible from there because they're so different. I read books about it. They have really destroyed basically the gospel in these Bibles. You cannot really read the correct gospel out of these because there's so many differences. And because of this, if you would give me one for free, I would throw it in the dustbin. It's really not worth reading them. And in that way, of course, it was always difficult that the truth comes through. So nowadays, you have know which text is correct. For us, it's not so difficult since we know it, but many churches, they are very happy with their New International Version, New Standard Version. I think in the internet you can see when you go like to Bible server or to Bible Hub, and so you can choose from all the varieties of translation. It's endless. I'm really amazed that in English I didn't count them, but it sounds to me like 50 different versions there are. And as far as I know, it's really a version that is translated according to Textus Receptus. All the other 49 versions, they are basically useless. I hope that nobody hears that and will go after me, because of course there are many people who have another opinion. But you can read many books, you can download them also in the internet, which talk about this, that Textus Receptus is the only correct text, and the others I wouldn't touch. Okay. Of course, I also was contemplating a study. There are really a few places, even in the King James version, when you go with some to there is this version called interlinear version, which where really each word from the original text is translated verbally, and sometimes you have to, because the sequence is also different of the words, so you have to make out what sense it is with all the words in that sentence. And I think there were maybe 3-4 places in the Bible where I was taught from that teacher. If you look at the interlinear, it cannot be like this because this word is missing. for this sentence, but it must mean this. It really makes sense because how it is written, it would really go against everything else that's in the Bible. It doesn't make sense at all. But if you word that correctly, then it makes sense. It is in accordance with the rest of the Bible. But these are minor things. They are not really central, and I think you can live with it even if you don't know it. You still will be able to understand the gospel correctly. The few verses that I know that could be translated a little bit better, they are in, I think they were in Corinthians and some of these letters. So the overall is really wonderful in James Version. And this version was also it was the basis for the theologies of all these Protestant Lutherans, Calvinists, and Anglicans by baptism. So they all were coming up and starting their churches based on this Bible. Nowadays, of course, many they change their opinions, but when they started these churches, they always were basing their theology on the received text, which we have from Lucian. Okay, now, that's what we were already seeing, that Bodinfeld and Jerome, they tried to put in errors and so. They were also, giving out these Latin versions, which, we have seen here it says that this Jerome, he was a polemic theologian and allowed his prejudices to warp his translations. So these versions from Jerome and Origen and all the others are really not what we should take care of. They're really not worth much. Also, the Ten Commandments were taken highly serious by the theology of those from Antioch, and they never said that commandments are out of fashion. That's what the Catholics have to say, because they changed the day of rest from the Sabbath to the first day. So they had to invent lots of strange theories to defend their strange theology. Also that this that we have that Jesus died for us. All this was what it was not clear in the beginning when Jesus died on the cross. The disciples at first said, "Oh, what happened? I think there was something wrong," and they didn't understand it. Only then later on they were finding out, that was necessary for us to be saved. All this was developed in Antioch, and they understood then the real theology that we today have. So then, of course, they also were having the Sabbath in Antioch, in Syria, and all Asia and Africa. We know that they were keeping the seventh day in, for example, in Asia, when until 1400 there were coming the Portuguese. They were at that time the mightiest and richest nation in the world, and they had very modest. So they came to many places in the world, and they didn't come alone. They always had some Jesuits on the ships, and the Jesuits told the locals, "Listen, you can do what you want. You become Catholic now, and if not, then we'll kill you." And where I was, I'm halfway living in South America, and there, when they came first, in that area it was the Spanish people. They came with the Jesuits, and at that time there were, for example, 30 million Incas living in that area. And after a few years, there were only 1 million left. So they were killing them by the millions. It's very sad story. It's touching the heart how cruelly they killed these people. And today they are almost separated, and all they brought us the gospel, how nice, but that's really distortion of history. It was really at this time, and so that's really how history really went. And history is written by the winners, so you don't hear that often, but there are still a few books around where you can read them. So that's how it was really very sad story. It's the same in Africa, and they were really killing them by the millions if they didn't want to become Catholic. Good. and only then, of course, when they came with the 49, then they changed and didn't believe in their in the true religion, I would say, the apostolic religion. Until then, they had the apostolic religion. They had the Saturday, they had the commandments, they had the correct Bibles, and then came these Jesuits, and until then, it was okay, and after that, it was a disaster. Then this is a very sad story. What we also have to know when we talk about this, that before the papacy could really rule Europe and partially the whole world, it was necessary for them to eradicate many Christians, because we read in these chapters in Revelation 13 and also in Daniel 7, 8, 9, that when the papacy comes, there are 10 horns, and it has to cut out 3 horns, and the little horn can come up, which was identified by the Reformators that it's Rome. And so Europe was falling into 10 countries, and 3 had eradicated. That's interesting to know what countries were eradicated. It was the Vandals, the Goths, and the West Goths. So the Vandals, where today is Tunisia, the West Goths were living where is Portugal, and since I'm living there, I was visiting a church there, which is built in 50 before Christ. That means it was even there before Christ, and and also where the Goths were living around Italy, and they were actually really Christians even before we were talking about the Essenes. So there were lots of groups spread in the world. They were probably partially also descendants from Jewish background, because they were dispersed one day, and they were probably also converts because these scriptures were so interesting on the Jews and they made sense, and their Hebrew religion didn't make any sense. So they were at least these 3 tribes, we call them tribes. They were basically countries with lots of people. I don't know the number, but they were quite numerous. And so they were keeping for example, they have there in that church, which is over much more than 2,000 years old, they have big basins for baptism pools. So with 2 by 3 meters where you can go in and get baptized by immersion. All these things they had already, because the Jews had that also. They had the mikvah, that is what they like baptism. They didn't come up with John the Baptist. It was already before Judaism. And so they were living this religion, and they, of course, they were keeping the 7th day, and they were having all these elements in their religion that the early Christians had. So they had, I would say, the proper faith. They were correct in what they believed, and of course, they were, I think they call them Arians. So they believed in the God the Father and His Son Jesus Christ, and not in 3 gods like those in Rome. And that's what had to be eradicated, because if there were so many people who believe completely different, Rome would not have had the influence that they had later in Rome. So they were killing all these. They were basically eradicating these nations. They were killing all the soldiers and all the government. Probably there remained a few people who were then some farmers, but they were not existing as countries anymore. And then Rome only could come up and got for 1,260 years, from 538, when they killed the last Vandals and Westgoths. Then they could really rule Europe for 1,260 years, which is repeated 7 times in the Bible. So it's meant what it means, because the more often it's repeated in the Bible, the more important it is. And if it's something like 7 times in it, then it must be really important to understand what does it mean. That we don't get lost in what religion is right, because they're at least constant, and we have to know which one is the correct one. So that was the situation. So they were spreading then their theology, were a Reformation, and it got some somehow better. That was the second part that I wanted to say. Yeah, I mean, what we can really learn from history until today is what did we learn when this time of 1260 years was over? Things get worse. Was the gospel spread much less then? No, it was the opposite. When this period was over, 1798, I think the Berthier from the centurion of Napoleon, he went to Rome, took the Pope captive, and he died in prison. So then the power of the Rome was over, and Christianity was spreading by leaps and bounds. They were doing Bible societies, they were printing the Bible in big numbers and spread them all over the world. They were making missionary societies, so they were going in all the world, from England and from America even, to spread the gospel in all the world. So the world, I would say, got much better since then. And the world got much freer, and that's also what I see. And it sounds a little bit strange, but if you go to countries that had the Reformation already quite early, for example, Germany, England, Switzerland, Scandinavia, there, I mean, they had since 500 years from now, they had not this oppressive system above them, so they could think clearly. They could see, yes, I mean, God sees everything that we do, and we have to be honest, and we have to be upright. We cannot sit down when the boss doesn't see it, because God sees us always, and we don't have to be hardworking and punctual in the morning. We cannot cheat and all this. And this, even though many people in these countries that I just mentioned are not believing in God anymore, but at least they have still this history, and that's somehow still in their genes, that you have to be honest and upright and hardworking and all this. We have also in Switzerland a few places that remained Catholic, very small places like in the mountains and so. And there are, I don't want to tell you now, there are stories around how the Catholics think. They always think you can cheat God, and you could make a sin, and then you tell it to the priest only a little bit altered, and then you don't get a big punishment. You just read 3 Ave Marias, and then it's forgiven. So this is they had to live under unlogical religion, where you have to pay to get your forgiveness for sins, and that there are mysterious things that doesn't make any sense, like 3 gods in one, and all these things. That's very strange for us today to understand how they could believe that, but it also shows that in these regions where the Catholics were predominant, there was no development taking place. All the inventions that we have today, like railways and telephones and cars, they were all coming from Protestant nations. I don't know anything that came good out of these Catholic nations, because when you have all this, you have to be afraid of that not a black cat runs over your street, then you will go in hellfire, and you have to burn forever, and all these things that will really paralyze your thinking, and you cannot be a person that is taking care of himself and is really saying, okay, I stand here before God, and what I do will be investigated by God. And so these nations couldn't really develop, these Catholic nations. And nowadays you still see what nations are the most affluent. Those who had very early reformations, and for 500 years it could develop in a natural way. Of course, unfortunately now it's going the other way around. All these nations that were before really very much blessed with the knowledge and the Reformation, they now only talk about LGBT and war and things that are really abominations. If you sit in the train in Switzerland, you don't see anybody with tattoos and earrings and all these things that God says it's an abomination. Don't pierce your body, don't write on your body. These abominations they do now. They don't want to listen to God's voice anymore. The church society in West Europe, and even the governments, they punish Christians now already, since you saw that probably in the news when you several people got into prison because they were training before a clinic where they were doing abortions, so they went to prison. So if the countries start behaving in an unchristian way and they're against Christianity, then you can also expect that the blessing is gone. And I fear that the punishments of God will come over these nations because they had all the privileges of the world. They had the best possibilities to become those who spread the gospel, and what they do, they fell so deeply that it was really terrible. And many other nations, like in South America, Protestantism is coming up. If you would go on Sunday on the street, almost everybody is on the street to go to any church there. So these are really Christians, and they read the Bible every day and they make their prayers. And these countries are coming up and they get more fluent, and it's more pleasant to live in these countries. It's more peaceful nowadays in some South American countries than in Europe. And these countries are getting the blessing. And I can imagine even here in Kenya, you are also having a lot of believers in the true God. So there will be a blessing on this. And that is what I'm very happy to see. I was really happy when I came here to see that there are so many Christians here. That's very nice. I mean, I wish we had so many Christians in Europe, but you will not find probably, I think the churches in Switzerland, they are about 1% of the populations. So really few people, and the rest, they all have the Buddha statue in their homes, and they're reading all kinds of things. It's very sad to see. Okay, in that way, I want to congratulate you for your that you have here a Christian country that is, I think, even in the TV, they talk about God that is unknown of in Europe. They will never talk about God in TV. In South America, it's completely normal. They talk about God all the time. That is something that was amazing for me, but I'm very happy to see, and I think it will get a big blessing on these countries. So I'm happy that God is always taking care that His knowledge is spread, that we can know Him, that He's not a cruel God, He's a love God. And if somebody really wants to get to know Him, we can follow His conscience. And God might even send angels like He does now in big numbers in the Muslim countries where it's not allowed to go and make mission work, but lots of Muslims have now dreams and visions where Jesus appears. I heard that in Iran, for example, there were 75 mosques, and 50 of those are closed because nobody goes there anymore. These are very intelligent people. They compare, okay, our religion really is only cruel and doesn't make any sense, and Christian religion does make much more sense. They also can download the Bible on the internet. Nobody is forcing them to stay Muslim there, and many turn to Christianity. There are by the millions. Same thing in Indonesia, in every year 2 million turn to Christianity. It's a big country, of course, it's 250 million, but that's already since over 10 years that's taking place. So the Christians are rising there because it seems they are honest and they get dreams from God. So that's what I want to say. God is a loving God, He wants us to know Him, and He's not cruel, and the Old Testament is not different than the New Testament. The system of and Satan is not the same. God remains the same. His commandments remain the same, and His scriptures remain the same. And by this, we can be sure that when we follow Him, He will save us because He loves us and He wants us to be with Him. So let's be faithful to Him, and I thank you for being here. And we'll stop with a prayer in this afternoon. Dear Father, thank you so much for the Bible. We thank you so much for all these reformators who are wonderful examples for us. Thank you for Lucia and those people who were giving us the Textus Receptus and the real Bible. We thank you for all the good preachers nowadays that explain many things to us, that are faithful to you and that are taught by you. And we ask you to also spread the news to us, that we can also be witnesses for your love to all the others that we are getting in contact with, that you can use us, and that we can bring many people to your salvation, and that we get eternal life. We thank you in the name of Jesus for all this. Amen.
Yeah.